Good morning, Professor Palmer. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, on my end at least, for a brief conversation on spiritual capital, leading up to the speaker series that we've been running under the SCMLi umbrella. A brief introduction first for our audience. Professor Palmer is an anthropologist at the Department of Sociology, the University of Hong Kong, and he will be giving us a brief presentation on spiritual capital in a Chinese religion context. And with that, thank you so much for agreeing to do that, and welcome to the series. I will have a couple of questions for you that you can hopefully answer. First of all, what does spiritual capital mean, and how did you become aware of the concept?
Yes, so good evening from Hong Kong, Alan, and yeah, so really happy to be able to have this conversation on spiritual capital. So I'm an anthropologist of religion in the Chinese and Asian world, and I've done a lot of research on religious and spiritual traditions in this part of the world. And one thing that I focused on a lot is actually the interface between religious traditions as they change and transform in the modern era, and how they actually influence the dynamics of a changing society. And one thing that I've always been aware of as I see this research is that I'm always interested in how spiritual traditions or spirituality, religion, how does it empower people in their lives and in the way that they engage with society and trigger or become involved in different processes of social change. And the way that I came across the notion of spiritual capital was, it was a number of years ago at the University of Hong Kong. We had the Faculty of Social Sciences launched a major project for developing entrepreneurship for the third sector, for civil society. And I was invited because they knew that I work on religion, and they knew that in Hong Kong, actually, religious organizations are a major component of the third sector of nonprofit organizations, of social service organizations. So it's clear that there's something in the religion that motivates people to engage in society, to take care of the poor and the needy, to try to bring about positive social changes. And so I was asked to develop a project for the religious component of this broader project. So there were different colleagues working on different aspects of developing the third sector in Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. And so people kind of handed this to me, and they didn't really know, they didn't know what was behind this religious thing, and they didn't really know how to conceptualize it. And to be honest, I didn't really either. And so we were kind of struggling to find a language to see how this would fit with those who are working on, different types of nonprofit management and social policy in relation to nonprofit groups and so on and so forth. And it was my research assistant at the time, Michelle Wong, who I guess she was doing some literature review or so on, and she mentioned spiritual capital. And then when I mentioned that to some colleagues in the faculty working on other aspects of this project, right away it clicked with them. And suddenly they were really interested in what I was doing, and somehow their minds started spinning. And so then we found that the term spiritual capital could be perhaps a very useful way of engaging in conversations about the role of spirituality as a resource or as a modality of empowerment when we're engaging in conversations with people who are in different areas of specialization, discipline, or different spheres. So I would say that spiritual capital for me is primarily it's two words which in certain contexts can help to communicate. But in other contexts, and this is what I found as I advanced in this project, they actually can hamper the communication. So so these are two words which in certain contexts can be very helpful for thinking through certain aspects of how spirituality can be socially empowering, and for engaging in conversations with people of different backgrounds.
That's very clear. So you've actually already touched on it a little bit, but besides, the linguistic construct, so to speak, what do you think spiritual capital can contribute to society?
So I think, and this is actually what I'm going to be talking about in my presentation in a couple of weeks. And I'm going to be using a framework that's derived from the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, and generally in sociological theory, we have different forms of capital, right? So we have financial or economic capital, and there's also social capital, which is your social networks. There's cultural capital, which is the kind of cultural knowledge that we acquire through education, through our family backgrounds, and so on. There's symbolic capital, which is prestige. So there's this notion that there are different ways, different forms of resource or capital that allow people to give people the means to do things in their lives and in society. But what is missing from these different forms of capital is the spiritual dimension. And so by talking about spiritual capital, then it raises the question, so what kinds of capacities does a spirituality or a spiritual orientation to life, what kinds of capacities does that give us? And how do those capacities relate to the capacities that we obtain through acquiring culture, acquiring social networks, acquiring economic benefits? And so I'd say that it's essentially important to be aware of the capacities that our spirituality can develop within us, our capacity to serve society, to contribute, and to act in society. But at the same time, it's also important to be aware of how that relates with various types of potentially productive tensions with the other types of capacities associated with the other types of capital.
Right. That sounds very interesting. And does this imply, have there already been developed practical applications for these ideas, or are we still in the realm of theory here?
So my own work in this field has been primarily working as an anthropologist, as a sociologist, and primarily at the level of empirical research, and also developing theoretical conceptualizations in the academic sphere. I know that there are many different conceptualizations out there that are more of an applied nature, and in the religious communities that I've studied, and I've studied and I've engaged with many different types of religious communities. There we see efforts to really apply or to reflect on and to find more systematic ways of applying spiritual understanding and spiritual capacities in different fields, such as development work, NGO work, management work, and so on and so forth. Some of these may use the terminology of spiritual capital. Others may not use those terminologies, but we could consider that they are doing that.
And I would assume that that's a way of bridging the worlds. We had a speaker talk about spiritual capital in the context of policy making, and he was speaking about how the language helps bridge, different concepts of society, different stakeholders within society to collaborate in a tangible term. Last question for you: how does spiritual capital relate to Chinese traditions, since you're going to be speaking about it from that particular angle? what can Chinese traditions tell us about spiritual capital and our understanding of it?
Yeah, so actually, to get into the answer to that question, I want to go back to what you just mentioned earlier about a language that helps to link up different worlds together. Now, because what I've found and what's really interesting is that on the one hand, speaking with certain types of people, such as policymakers or people in the sphere of management in particular, I think that talking about capital and spiritual capital, that opens doors to communicate. And also when we're using the word spiritual, which is an open-ended concept, which people generally have a general understanding of, but it's actually sufficiently undefined that it allows people of different religious traditions, people who don't consider themselves to be religious, they can all come together and talk and explore about the spiritual and spirituality. So the open-endedness of the concept is very productive in that sense. But conversely, though, actually what's been very interesting is that then when I started talking about spiritual capital, and then I went to some of the groups that were actually doing things that could be considered to be, generating spiritual capital and applying spiritual capital. Religious groups, often they're like, we're not doing spiritual capital here. Especially the word capital is not welcomed, because actually what these groups want to do is they want to overcome, and often critically overcome, the shortcomings of capitalism. Yes. And not necessarily from a socialist angle, but more from a spiritual angle, which is what spirituality is about, overcoming the, greed and the propensity to always accumulate material benefits. Yes. So they don't want to. So there's the objection that to talk about this as spiritual capital might lead to a profound misunderstanding of what we're doing. And so here's where it actually becomes interesting. So that's why I call it a productive tension. And so in my talk, I'm going to be talking about Chinese tradition. And one reason I'm going to be doing that is simply because it's something I know something about. And I'm going to be talking about three different Chinese traditions: there's Confucianism, Daoism, and Chinese Buddhism. Now, on the one hand, this helps us to, as I was saying, the concept of spirituality is very open-ended, and that's very welcoming, and different people can share different ideas and perspectives. On the other hand, when we get into specific traditions, then we get to more highly specified understandings of what spirituality is, or equivalence to spirituality. What is it? How do you develop it? How do you put it into practice? So by comparing three different traditions, we can get three different angles or three different approaches to what we might call spiritual capital. Now, the other thing is, what we will also see in Confucianism, Daoism, and Buddhism is three different levels of tension between secular forms of capital, or the economic, social, cultural, and symbolic capital, so more instrumental forms of capital, and more spiritual forms of capital. So in a sense, here's the teaser: Confucianism has the least tension with those types of capital, but it still has a very strong sense of moral principle that does enter into tension and helps you to lead or to orient your work within the social network building, within the world of business, and the world of culture. Taoism has a slightly higher level of tension, and Buddhism has potentially the highest levels of tension. And yet, in all three cases, these tensions can be highly productive. So I think here where the notion of spiritual capital will invite us to look at how the tensions between different types of capital can actually help us to orient our world, our life in this material world. How do we deal with relationship building? How do we deal with networking? How do we deal with the necessity to develop material resources? How do we deal with the games of prestige and so on? These are situations that we're all into if we are living in this world. And so how do these spiritual traditions not only give guidelines for how to navigate that, but how do they give capacity to navigate these realms of social life effectively, happily, and in ways that are benevolent, compassion, and of benefit to serving humanity. So that's kind of what I'm going to be trying to get at in my talk.
Wow, that sounds fascinating. I'm looking forward to exploring these ideas. I particularly like the idea of productive tension, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about that. So with that, thank you so much for this brief introduction. We're looking forward to having you on January 11th to explore some more.
Okay, thank you very much. Look forward to see you then.
Likewise.